Welcome to the Born Free podcast, where we'll discuss the challenges facing the world's wildlife and ecosystems. My name's Sarah Locke, and I'll be talking to the passionate people doing their bit to try and secure a future where wildlife and humans can peacefully coexist. So today we're joined by Ian Redmond. Thank you very much for joining us, Ian.
My
you
pleasure.
are, and I've got a list now, tropical field biologist, conservationist. You were mentored by Dr Dian Fossey. You are founder of the Ape Alliance and a conservation consultant for the gorilla organisation, the Orangutan Foundation, I4, and of course Born Free Foundation. I'm sure there's a few things that I've missed out on there, but thank you very much anyway. And I guess let's start from the very beginning. Your career famously started as a biologist with the late Dr Dian Fossey in Rwanda studying mountain gorillas. How did that amazing opportunity come about?
It's kind of you to refer to my life as having a career.
No, sorry.
No, so stuff happens and I try and keep up, but it wouldn't fit into most... my career advisor at school and university wouldn't have recognised what I do as a career, I don't think. But my interest in natural history goes back to infancy, as far as I know.
Mm-hmm.
As long as I can remember, I've been fascinated by all life forms, and that fascination led me to do a degree in biology. And while I was at Keele University studying biology, I became secretary of the Biology Society, which was great because, if you saw some interesting research or heard of someone doing something interesting, you wrote to them, old-fashioned piece of paper.
I love that, how you were pointing out to me what writing was.
Well, but rather than
Sarah.
typing, there were no emails. This is in the mid-70s, so you wrote to them and invited them to come and speak, and then you got to meet them and hear about their work. And one such speaker was Sandy Harcourt, who was then writing up his PhD, having spent 2 years collecting data at Dian Fossey's research centre in Rwanda. And Sandy gave me Dian's address and gave me some advice. He said it's a very remote camp. If you can mend things, just mention that, because when things break and you live in the middle of a forest in the middle of what most people regard as nowhere,
Mm-hmm.
it's hard to get things fixed. And I am a sort of compulsive fixer. I can't help twiddling and trying to mend things. So I wrote to Dian and said my academic supervisors didn't rate me very highly, but that I was enthusiastic, and if she wanted someone to make the tea or mend the roof,
Do a bit of sewing on the side.
I'd be happy to come and help. And several months later, after finals, when I didn't know what I was going to do next, this very exciting letter arrived covered in airmail stickers and colourful stamps from Rwanda, in which Dian basically said, if you can get here, we'll try you. She outlined the disadvantages of living in a tin hut in the middle of a forest at 10,000 feet above sea level, 3,000 metres, where it rains a lot and it's cold and there's no company, no amenities or facilities. But for a naturalist, you're living in the middle of a wonderland. It's a montane rainforest with every tree draped with usnea, the Spanish moss, which is actually a lichen, and flowers and mountain gorillas.
Amazing.
And elephants and antelope and buffalo and birds. So, yes, I was very excited in November 76 to get to Rwanda and start that work. And what wasn't mentioned was that gorillas should really carry a government health warning because they are addictive.
Really?
They're wonderful. If you spend time with, I would say, any of the large, intelligent social mammals whose behaviour in so many ways mirrors ours, and in fact with gorillas, much of it is from our shared ancestry. It is endlessly fascinating, and here I am 40-something years later still fascinated by and getting the opportunity every year to go and hang out with gorillas.
So were you studying their behaviour then?
I was going along as a general dog's body,
Okay.
I was the camp gopher, which is why when the BBC came to film, I was told to go for the BBC.
Yeah.
Go down. But I was collecting general behavioural data and movement records of the gorillas, just old-fashioned tracking, finding the gorillas, logging their location. This was again before GPS, so taking a bearing on a mountain if it was visible, but of course this is a montane rainforest, so there's a lot of cloud, a lot of mist. Gorillas in the Mist, which was the title of Dian's book, and the movie that was made,
of course,
very loosely based on her book, starring Sigourney Weaver and Brian Brown. And that Gorillas in the Mist sounds very lyrical and romantic.
Yeah, it does. It sounds beautiful.
Gorillas in the Downpour is more often
I love that.
a description of what it's like studying mountain gorillas at that sort of altitude in that sort of habitat.
I'm surprised it was cold. I don't know why. In my head, I suppose being that high up it would be. But in my head, I kind of imagined it being very humid and warm. But clearly that wasn't the case.
Humid and cold.
Okay, humid and cold, sure.
At least, well, it's. I advise people when they're going to see the gorillas to dress or to pack as if they're going for a holiday in the Lake District.
Okay.
If the sun comes out, it's delightful. It's hot and sunny, but you expect it to rain. You never go out into the field without a waterproof in your bag. Otherwise, you get drenched and soaked to the skin. And at 10,000 feet, when you're soaked to the skin, well, for me, as long as I'm walking, I keep warm. But as soon as you sit down, you start to lose heat. And if your clothes are wet, that evaporation also takes heat from your body, and you end up shivering. And I've sat sometimes, when you're with the gorillas, they're so engrossing that you forget about your bodily comfort. You're just watching and taking
they're very
notes.
Sedentary, aren't they, when you watch them?
Well, it depends. That depends what time of day you arrive.
Okay.
Their daily cycle is that they wake up in their nice, comfortable night nest. They might have breakfast in bed, or they might roll out of bed and start feeding nearby. They feed for 2 or 3 or 4 hours, depending on the quality of food and how much there is available. But they're travel feeding. They move a few yards, eat all that they want to eat, move a few yards, eat. And then eventually, when they're feeling full, they settle down for a day rest. Build a little nest, not as elaborate as a night nest, but somewhere comfy to sit and snooze. Kids play, climbing trees.
It sounds very poetic.
It's lovely. And my first day with the gorillas, not my first day in the field, but my first day with the gorillas, it felt like I joined a family picnic.
Oh, that's so lovely.
With adults snoozing and relaxing and grooming each other, and just chilling. And kids, too much energy for that. They're climbing trees and wrestling with each other and playing. And my job on that first occasion was to learn to recognize the individual faces. And each gorilla has a very different face. But for first-timers, I mean, people tell me that shepherds can tell all their sheep individually, but to me they all look like sheep. So a flock of sheep, hard to identify. Family of gorillas, you soon see that there are distinctive features, but especially the folds of skin above the nostrils, which form little crinkles.
How long did it take you to kind of be able to recognise each one?
Well, a while. I mean, a few weeks to be absolutely sure, because sometimes you've seen them from the side, and if there's two individuals who are about the same age with a similar nose print, the nose print is what you call the sketch of the pattern of lines.
Okay.
And like a fingerprint, it's unique to that individual, but unlike a fingerprint, you can't go out with a bit of ink and
get a nice little
take an impression.
imprint. Yeah.
But you can sometimes get a clear photograph, or more likely, in those days, you'd be sitting with binoculars and sketching what you saw. So I got very good at drawing gorilla nostrils and the lines above. The rest of the gorilla didn't always look so good when I did a whole portrait, but those prints I was quite good at.
Amazing. So how long were you out there on your first trip then?
My first trip was 18 months.
And the second one, was that just as...
No, the second one was for about 4 months, because there was an incident that required me to get some medical attention.
Okay. For you?
For me, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. But I mean, you must have some amazing stories from the field. Sorry, can you elaborate maybe on that one, or is there another one that you can share with us?
Gorillas have long had a reputation for being very fierce and dangerous, and that's because they have a very impressive threat display. And when they're attacked, or when they feel that they're under attack, they will bark very loudly. I once damaged a BBC microphone in the broadcasting house by barking straight into it, and we had to move into a different studio. So I won't do the very loud bark. And if pushed, then the silverback, the adult male, 2 or 3 times the size of an adult human in terms of breadth and weight, but about the same height, so 5'6", 6 foot in height, but just huge, muscular, powerful animal will come hurtling towards you at speed, going, "Wah!" And what you see, if you happen to see it, is this massive, black, shaggy mass hurtling towards you, centered by this red mouth with very long canine teeth going, "Ah!" And it's very intimidating.
That sounds absolutely terrifying.
Which is obviously what it's designed to do. And if you run away, he may well chase you and bite you in the bum. And there are tribes in Africa where it's a mark of a coward to be bitten by a gorilla, because they know if you stand your ground, he will stop.
So did this happen to you on quite a few occasions, or?
Well, the gorillas that Dian was studying were habituated, so they got used to the idea of tame humans that knew about what is polite and impolite in gorilla society, didn't attack them. And this is what Dian's great gift to the world was when she began her work in 1967. So I got there in 76, so 9 years, nearly 10 years later. She'd worked out how to win their trust, how to go into a forest and convince a family of gorillas who were terrified of humans because they'd only ever met humans as aggressors or hunters, that this particular human was okay. And that led to being accepted into gorilla families almost as an honorary member of the family, and being able to observe their family life, these little intimate details, it is absolutely amazing, and it's wonderful. And the fact that the gorillas now tolerate a daily visit of 8, usually, tourists from anywhere in the world to come and see them is truly wonderful. And it is one of those bucket list things that people really want to do before they kick the bucket, go and see gorillas. And not just see them. People usually want to take photographs, but when I'm taking people, I usually insist, at least for 5 minutes, put the camera down. The camera will give you souvenirs, but if you haven't actually experienced what you're photographing, the memory is not so meaningful. So I encourage people to sit down and just take it in. And if they get the chance to meet the gaze of a gorilla, you're always advised, don't stare at the gorillas, which is very rude in gorilla society as in human society. But if you're sitting there and you happen to catch their eye, you can hold it for a moment and then look away. And that moment where you realize that there's a mind behind that eye is quite profound. And I see people sometimes move to tears or change their perspective on life because they've suddenly met a being who isn't a human being,
but still a being.
A gorilla being. And that connection of mind to mind is it's hard to explain if you haven't experienced it. But people who go to zoos say this, and it's horrible for the animal sitting in a zoo without all the complexities of life in the wild. But for the human who gets a chance to perhaps exchange a glance, it can be very meaningful. But then if that human thinks about it a little bit, wait a minute, this is a being who can think and clearly has a mind, and we are keeping that being in an enclosure for our entertainment or our pleasure. That's where you start to question that whole concept.
No, definitely. And I know that you've been involved in over 50 documentaries on gorillas, which is just an amazing number. I mean, how do you go about finding new material each time? Is it that complexity of behaviour that you find so rich?
Well, there's certainly that, and I worked on over 100 different documentaries about all sorts of things, but there are a lot of them about gorillas and a lot of them about elephants, which are the two species I've spent most time studying. And each documentary maker has their idea of what they're trying to tell. So sometimes it's telling the story of the research and what we've learned about particularly mountain gorillas. They've had more documentaries made about them than any of the other kinds of gorillas. But because I understand a little of gorilla behaviour and how to behave around them, if I have a film crew with me, I can sometimes get them into a position where they're not too close, because you don't want people who just come from the other side of the world to be close enough that if they cough or breathe over the gorilla, they would pass on their flu or cold germs. So you're trying to keep at a safe distance, it's safe for the gorillas as well as for the humans, but to get the opportunity to film the little details of behaviour that are so fascinating. But gorillas live in very dense vegetation, So imagine going into a bramble thicket in an overgrown garden and trying to film an animal that's just 2 yards away, but all you can see is thorns and leaves. That's very often the case with gorillas. They like blackberries, and so they're often sitting in a bramble thicket, and you see the odd hairy arm reaching out and then pulling back in some berries and eating them. And that's interesting to a point, but then you kind of want to see the whole action, and that's what's challenging in filming gorillas. They're often under dense canopy, so there's not a lot of light. They are themselves largely black, and so they suck in photons and don't bounce many out again. And it is quite challenging. It's better today because today's digital cameras are much better at filming in low light than they were in the 70s when.
Yeah, and I mean, you were obviously famed for that amazing encounter. You brought together David Attenborough and the mountain gorillas, that encounter. Do you want to just explain that to listeners? And also, I mean, did you know at the time what kind of a historical piece that would become?
Well, the answer to the second question, no. The Life on Earth gorilla sequence made television history and is one of the most replayed sequences.
Yeah, it really is.
In any television, not just natural history television. But at the time, David wanted to explain the importance of the opposable thumb in evolution. And Life on Earth was his first big, blue-chip, groundbreaking series that looked at the evolution of all life forms on Earth. A 13-part series, each program an hour long. And out of those 13 hours, which covered thousands of species and therefore thousands of experts introducing the film crew to their species, the one bit that everyone remembers is the gorilla sequence.
Yeah,
I feel very sorry for the people who introduced the BBC to flatworms or corals or all the other species that were featured. But no, the penultimate program was called Life in the Trees. It was about primates in general, as in non-human primates, and the final program was about humans. So it took a very, very academic approach to the story of life on Earth. And when I was told to go for the BBC and find them, I didn't know where they were staying. I just walked around Kigali.
Oh, is that what happened? I kind of thought they would have approached you. That was amazing.
Well, they wrote to Diane.
Yeah.
And she agreed for them to come.
Oh, I see. But
and
then
so Diane told me
just
to go and get them.
Okay.
But it wasn't a case of going to the airport to meet their flight. So I found them in Kigali, which then was more of a capital village than a capital city. It was quite small. And a couple of white blokes walking down the road, I walked close to them to overhear them, and they were talking in an English accent. And I said, I don't suppose you're from the BBC, are you? And yes, they were. So David Attenborough was flying in from another film shoot somewhere else. He had been filming manta rays off the Great Barrier Reef.
Oh, wow.
The week before he filmed gorillas, and the week after he was going to Gombe to film chimpanzees, where Jane Goodall did her famous study. So I do remember on the way back from the first gorilla contact with them, just saying there can't be many natural history spectacles you haven't seen yet, and he was his usual modest self, saying, well, there's still a lot more to see, and that was in 1978, January 1978, and since then, every year it seems we've seen another Attenborough spectacular series, or every couple of years. So he's still finding new discoveries to show to the world. But the gorilla sequence was special, and it certainly, I think, had a huge impact on people's perception of gorillas.
Yeah.
Here was a then not as well known, but fairly well known television presenter. Sitting, not just observing the gorillas, but interacting with them. And no one expected that to happen. The aim was to have him talk about the opposable thumb with the gorillas behind him. But gorillas, it's a free forest, that they can move where they want. And because they seem to have an understanding of the concept of a friend of a friend. So if someone they know is there, and there's a couple of strangers with someone they know, they'll be interested, but they won't be alarmed.
Yeah.
If you turned up and they don't know who you are, they'll be much more nervous. But for these gorillas, who at that time did not see different people every day, it was long before gorilla tourism was invented. So then a newcomer was a potential threat, but because the newcomers were with people they knew, they accepted them. And they accepted them to such an extent that young gorillas started to climb on and interact with David Attenborough, examining his clothing and shoelaces, and one juvenile called Pablo sat in his lap. Now, this wasn't on the script. And in those days, of course, filming, you actually had a can of film. It wasn't like you can just shoot as much video as you want and it's on the hard drive and you just choose what you want. You had to know what each foot of film was going to be about, and there wasn't much room for playing about. But luckily, John Sparks, the producer, said to the cameraman, the late Martin Saunders, sadly recently deceased, I'll just film a bit of this. It'll give the guys in the cutting room something to laugh about. But there was no expectation that it would be included in the programme. So when Pablo sat and sprawled on him and David was grimacing a little, and I think that's probably because baby gorillas, they have quite bony bottoms. They don't have the big buttock muscles that humans have. And having a baby gorilla grinding a bony bottom into your groin, perhaps not quite so comfortable.
So
anyway,
were you kind of watching in the sidelines while this is happening? Were you present
that
for that?
particular day, Diane had taken them
Okay.
out. So when Pablo sat on David, that was a Dian Fossey day. But the day where he did there is more meaning and mutual understanding and exchanging a glance with the gorilla than any other animal I know bit.
You've
which
done that before.
He must have thought about before, but there was no script. I mean, he was just speaking as it came out. And that very eloquent piece to camera really summarises how fascinating gorillas are and how we have misrepresented them as being the aggressive monster, which unless threatened, they're not, and which very often humans in our the worst aspects of our behaviour of warfare and torture and the horrible things that we do to each other, we are in some ways much more monstrous than they are. But we've been heaping this image of the monster on the gorilla when in truth, yes, if a gorilla is angry and fighting with another silverback, it's a spectacular battle. Nobody usually dies. There might be some injuries. And once it's sorted, the rest of the day and the rest of the week, most of their life is peaceful family life and would in many ways be an example to us.
Yeah, no, it was so important for gorilla conservation and for wildlife tourism, seeing that piece, I think, with David Attenborough, really important. And you've obviously got a passion for sentient animals. I know we just touched on elephants. Can you tell us a little bit about your work for elephant protection? I know in particular you came across the cave-dwelling elephants of Mount Elgon, is that right? Yes.
Well, the first elephants I met were in the Virungas on the way to the gorillas. Very occasionally, on a good day, we'd see elephants in the same forest, sometimes rarely, but interacting with the gorillas or being aware of each other, and that was fascinating. But the year before I got there, the last of the elephants that were resident around Karisoki, Diane's research centre, had been killed by ivory poachers. So only occasionally did elephants come over from the Congo side into Rwanda and interact with us or the gorillas. So elephants were an occasional treat while I was studying gorillas. But then in 1980, I heard of this bizarre phenomenon of elephants going underground. It was part of a round-the-world expedition called Operation Drake, which when the ship that sailed around the world, the Eye of the Wind, called into a country, they would set up lots of sort of mini expeditions. And one of them in Kenya was to document the use of these caves by elephants and to build a path so that visitors coming to the cave wouldn't go on the same path as the elephants for obvious reasons.
Sure.
And so we constructed a path into the cave, and that path served for decades. It's only a couple of years ago that they put in some more robust steps. But that image of elephants underground and the sound, because you don't just see them, it's usually dark. They're coming in at dusk or after dark. And so you just hear that low infrasonic rumble and you feel it with your skin as much as with your eardrums. Hearing that in a cave where it's echoing around and the whole air is vibrating, is unbelievable.
Amazing.
I get goosebumps just thinking about it.
So what were they doing? Just want to explain to listeners, just in case they don't know the story. Are they getting salt? Is that right?
That's right. It's a subterranean salt lick. But elephants can't actually lick the salt because their tongue isn't long enough to get around their tusks and the trunk.
Yeah,
in the way.
The logistics.
So they use their tusks as chisels and sort of scrape the walls. And if you go into the cave, even when there are no elephants there, you can see the walls are covered in tuskings where elephants have chiseled off bits of rock, and then they ingest the rock. They eat it. And again, I've been in the cave and you can hear them going cracking sometimes fist-sized lumps of rock that they've looped up with their trunk and popped in their mouth, and then are sucking and chewing and swallowing. And that excavation and ingestion and then leaving the cave means that the next day you look at their dung and it's full of bits of rock. And if you collect a pile of dung and put it in a bucket and swish it around in water, obviously the rock falls to the bottom, and then pull the vegetation out, and what you're left with is half a bucket full of rock. Okay, now think about that over thousands of years, and suddenly you see that the volume of the cave can be explained by elephant mining, and that these aren't caves that elephants randomly walk into. They're actually elephant salt mines that go back to when there wasn't a cave and there was just a cliff. And the cliff is an exposure of mineral-rich rock. It's volcanic agglomerate or ash that's been spewed out by the volcano. And what happens in several parts of the world where elephants dig into a cliff to get minerals is that over a while you get an overhang and then it collapses. So over a period of time, you have a slowly receding cliff. But on Mount Elgin, the mineral-rich layer is capped by a lava flow, which is much harder and impervious. So that acts like an umbrella to keep the rain off the soluble salts inside, which is why that layer is still full of salts. It's not usually sodium chloride. It doesn't taste salty to the tongue. It's sodium sulfate. But when digested, it still releases the sodium ions, which we all need as mammals for our physiology to work. So when animals are salt hungry, they eat salt-rich vegetation. They'll go around tasting different bits of soil or rock until they find some that taste good. And this is why when we put salt on our chips, it tastes good. Our bodies are saying, yes, eat that, we need the sodium ions. Because we seem to have lost the mechanism to say, and that's enough. So we tend to overdo it. But most animals have an inbuilt sort of calibration, and they know that when their system's got enough salt, they stop looking for it. And when they get salt hungry, their salt appetite drives them to somewhere like this. And somewhere like this is normally above ground, but on Mount Elgin, that receding cliff is going on underneath the lava flow. So it ends up being a cave. And then the cave gets deeper and deeper, and there are rock falls, but the lava flow holds. So for perhaps thousands of years, there is a cave into which elephants go, and it's getting bigger and being excavated on the sides. And when there's a big lump of hard rock in the ash, they tusk around it, and you get these lumps of rock that stick out of the wall. Then eventually they drop off, and sometimes the ceiling collapses.
The whole thing.
And when that collapses, if it's mineral rich, the elephants will eat that. So there are places where the cave is far higher than an elephant can reach because they've eaten the stuff that's fallen out the roof. So you have this whole evolution of caves as a result of elephant mining, which I was just blown away by.
Yeah,
At university, I did for 2 years geology as well as biology. So suddenly finding a study where I was using my geological knowledge and my passion for animals, and it's not just elephants that go in the cave. There are bats living there, not just insectivorous bats, but fruit bats too. There are antelopes coming to the cave, and even I've photographed a black and white colobus monkey, which is a foliovoid, eats leaves. So it too is eating leaves that are low in mineral salts. It needs to get the salt from somewhere. They go into the mouth of the cave, not into the dark. And it's a rubbish photograph. It's a black and white monkey in a cave. It's never going to be very very exciting. But for me, it was exciting because it showed that all the animals in the forest that are salt hungry will go to the caves for the salt, and the predators in the forest, they go to the caves not to get the salt, but to get the animals that are going for the salt. So you could say they get their meat ready salted. And so I've seen leopard come into the mouth of the cave to eat antelope or whatever species they can get. The caves of Mount Elgin, they should be a World Heritage Site. They are fantastic.
Amazing.
And those elephants got were hit by the ivory poachers, even though their tusks got worn down and stumpy because of the mining. About a third of an elephant's tusk is the root in the elephant's face, and that and the bit protruding as ivory prices rose in the mid-80s, those elephants were targeted and were hit. And in 1987, I found myself standing beside the carcass of a young male elephant that I'd named Charles. And he'd had his face sliced off, and it seemed to be in a single plane, which suggested that they were equipped with a chainsaw, the poachers.
Wow.
And they obviously had local knowledge because they'd waited on top of the cave as the elephants approached the cave and had ambushed them in the mouth of the cave. And the elephants had fled. They hadn't been using elephant guns, large caliber ammunition for killing elephants. They'd just been using what everyone can easily get hold of in Africa. If you want to kill animals, you get an AK-47.
Yeah.
But that's little bullets designed for killing people. And you have to spray a lot of those into an elephant or be very accurate to kill an elephant. So what they'd done is sprayed bullets into a herd of elephants. Some of them died, some of them didn't. Some of them might still be having the injuries caused by that attack. But Charles was killed, and a little baby elephant whose skull was the size of a basketball was killed. And those tusks were recovered, and they were the size of carrots.
Yeah.
And the thought of people killing baby elephants who could potentially live for 60, 70 years for a pair of tusks the size of a carrot it's obscene.
Yeah, heartbreaking. What are their populations like now?
The Elgin elephants are recovering. We don't know exactly how many that they are because it's difficult to count elephants in forests because you can't do aerial surveys. They're underneath the canopy. But the estimate is 200 or 300. Some people think even possibly more than that. But we fear that at the lowest point in the late 80s, they'd got to under 100. So the protection has improved, and part of that came with the ivory ban. So the killing of Charles and many other Elgin elephants prompted me to launch an appeal in BBC Wildlife magazine called the African Ele Fund. And then I asked other charities to launch the same appeal. And I said I didn't want people to take administration fees off. Let's put all the money into practical projects on the ground. And what was then a young charity, Zuchek, was part of the Ele Fund appeal. But then Zuchek joined together with Care for the Wild and WSPA, the World Society for the Protection of Animals, now the World Animal Protection, WAP, to form a campaign called Ele Friends. And that was in 1989. And the Ele Friends campaign was launched in May 89 to raise the profile of elephants and act like a sort of a PR campaign for elephants, so that in September 89, when the CITES meeting took place, the Conference of the Parties to CITES, where there was a proposal to list African elephants on Appendix 1, which means no international commercial trade in them or their products, including ivory. Now, the ivory trade was so lucrative and so many countries benefited from it, seemed unlikely that we could ever get a ban on such an everyday product. At that time, there was no internet, but people did home shopping using a big catalogue. And in the catalogue of goods, of lawnmowers and washing machines, you find in the jewellery section ivory. So people in England and in America would sit and look through the catalogue and order something, not thinking that by doing so, their money was going to pay some illegal activity. I mean, there was a legal ivory trade, but the illegal trade was riding on the back of that. So the Ele Friends campaign was to try and win that ban, and we had a pledge. It wasn't a petition, it was a pledge. We, the undersigned, promise never to buy or sell or wear or display ivory. At that point, we weren't asking for money. We just wanted their agreement that they would not do this. And by the time we got to the CITES conference, Will Travers hired a van and took the paper pledges, because, again, it wasn't digital, pieces of paper. We had more than 600,000 signatures, and with other campaigns from around the world, there was 1 million or so.
Amazing.
Signatures on pieces of paper that had to get to Lausanne in Switzerland to be handed over to the CITES Secretariat, saying that the world does not want there to be an ivory trade. And with an amendment, the proposal went through. And the amendment was that if any countries could show that they had poaching under control and everything was fine, they would be allowed to trade their ivory, to downlist. And that's what we have at the moment, a split listing. And every effort to try and get all elephants onto Appendix 1 to completely close the trade is opposed by the few southern African countries who ignore the wishes of the rest of Africa. There are 37 countries in Africa with elephants, and 4 or 5 in the south want to perpetuate the trade. The rest of Africa and Asia, where the Asian elephants are also hit by the ivory trade because the males are killed for their tusks, the females don't have tusks. It's still happening. It's still an issue. So much so that last year, on Mount Elgin, I was there with a German film crew making a documentary about the underground elephants, and we came across the carcass of another male that I knew. He was probably in his 40s, and he was known as Big Tembo. Not a very original name. Tembo is Swahili for elephant, and he was the biggest of the Elgin elephants. So the Mount Elgin Elephant Monitoring Team, the MEME team, that Born Free supported from 2001 to 2016, the MEME team had called him Big Tembo. And the irony there was that he was killed by poachers literally days after China closed its domestic ivory market.
That's so sad.
So the legal trade in ivory in China is now closed, but there is still illegal trade, and there are still dealers who hope that one day the ivory trade will be reopened, and so people are stockpiling ivory in the hope that will be a value in future. And that leads to the death of elephants like Charles, who was killed in 1987, and Big Tembo, who was killed at the beginning of last year. And that is so frustrating.
I bet.
That after all that time, elephants, and some of them known individuals, but the fact that I happen to know an elephant and give it a name doesn't really matter. Each elephant has a value. And you can be philosophical and say, well, they are intelligent social mammals, they've got a brain 4 times the size of ours. Of course we should respect their intelligence and their complex society. But we can also think more selfishly about the ecological role they play. Because elephants are the gardeners of the forest. They've been called the mega gardeners of the forest because they're so big. And it's a fact that elephants disperse more individual seeds of more species further than any other animal. So we're now at a time of climate crisis. We've realized that we cannot keep putting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere because it's affecting our weather and our ability to grow crops and ultimately our ability to survive. So we need more trees. And people say, oh, we should plant trees, as if humans are the only things that plant trees. Long before humans came along, animals were dispersing seeds and planting trees. And so protecting elephants, which I'm convinced the only way to do that completely is to stop the ivory trade and make ivory unfashionable, make it an item of shame, not of pride. People used to think ivory meant that you were classy. Oh, that real ivory, yes. And you got some status out of that. Now it means if you're displaying ivory, you're saying, oh, I support organised crime, the murder of rangers and customs officers, and the killing of endangered species and destroying of ecosystems. That's what ivory represents today. So we're trying very hard to finish the job of closing the ivory trade, protecting elephants on the ground so that they can continue. And if Big Tembo had not been shot, if he was about 45, as I think, then he probably had 15 years of being the dominant male, siring the infants of the next generation of Elgin elephants, passing on the culture of that cave behavior, which is unique to that population of elephants, which makes them very interesting academically, but they're able to survive in that low-sodium habitat because of that knowledge. And in protecting the elephants, you protect the trees of tomorrow, because when they eat fruit today and nuts today, it passes through the digestive tract, lands in a nice little pile of manure, which is the dung. When it decomposes, it's got all the right nutrients for the germinating seedlings, and those seeds are of species of trees that have co-evolved with animals like elephants or gorillas or chimpanzees or orangutans. Wherever you are in the world, there will be fruit-eating animals that have developed along with the tree. So the tree has evolved seeds that are tough enough to survive the passage through the gut of an animal and therefore are dispersed a long way from the parent plant. But if those seeds don't get eaten and chewed by an animal and swallowed, then that protective casing is so good it doesn't let the water in. So very few of them will germinate if they just fall off the tree, and they'll be under the parent anyway. So what you want is seed dispersal and seed preparation and then fertilizer. That's what elephants do best of all. Gorillas are second only to elephants in their ability to disperse seeds and leave them in the right place. So for our efforts to stabilize the climate today, we need to protect the gardeners of the forest. Hashtag gardeners of the forest. And then you'll find, if you go to that hashtag, you'll find all sorts of articles and films about this phenomenon, which many people, when they're thinking they want to protect gorillas, it's because they're like us, or protect elephants because we like them. And those are very anthropocentric points of view, but the biocentric point of view that takes in the whole biosphere, the living part of the planet in which we live, is that they are part of the life support system of our planet. And protecting them, each individual who has perhaps decades ahead of him or her to play this role, is an important part of the global ecology, even though it's one animal. I would argue that particularly for the larger animals, their role is so important. We need to value every one. So another reason to oppose trophy hunting. The trophy hunters say, oh, you're just killing one animal and the money helps all of them. Actually, no, you're taking one of the seed dispersal agents out of the forest when we've already lost 95% of them. More than 95% of elephants have gone, and most of the other large mammals have seen these massive declines in their numbers, which means there aren't enough of the workforce of the forests and savannas and the other ecosystems upon which we all develop.
No, you're right. So I suppose, the individual has such a wider role rather than just the individual. And just touching on that, I know that you mentioned obviously Charles and Big Tembo, but there was Digit, wasn't there? The gorilla. Do you want to just tell us a little bit about him?
Yes, the two sort of conservation milestones in my life were the death of Digit, who was a young silverback, and then 10 years later, the death of Charles, a young male elephant. And Digit became a sort of a symbol. Diane set up a charity, the Digit Fund, which then evolved into the Dian Fossey Gorilla Fund International in America and the Gorilla Organization in the UK. But his life was sort of symbolic because he was one of the first gorillas to befriend humans. And Diane watched him from infancy to maturity. He sired his first son but didn't live to see that son. So it's a very dramatic story. And because I knew Digit, and it was my misfortune to find his body after poachers had killed him, and his head had been cut off, hands were cut off, because at that time in Rwanda there was a market for gorilla skulls and hands. People visiting Rwanda would buy them as gruesome curios to take home with them. So an individual who was known to humans was killed, many would say murdered, for bits of his body that could be sold. And the person taking that decision was being entirely rational. He had no money, and someone was prepared to pay for those bits. He wouldn't normally go out and kill a gorilla. It was some foreigner who's saying he'd buy it. So again, with elephants, it's foreigners saying they want their front teeth. Their front teeth, bring the elephant's front teeth. What? Oh, okay, yeah, you've got money. I need money. I'll kill an elephant. And the lesson, I think, from both of those stories is that we mustn't demonize people living in poverty who are corrupted by money from overseas to go into poaching. What we need to do is to provide them with better alternatives. And that's what I've seen both with the gorilla conservation and around Mount Elgin. You give people, you respect their skills and their needs for their family. You find them employment that is protective of the forest and of the animals, and they don't want to go into poaching. Poaching is illegal. You end up in prison or you end up being shot by a ranger. Who wants to do that out of choice? It's usually poverty that's attached to that. And by helping people out of poverty to help them protect animals, you then protect the animals and their ecosystem, which is all part of our trying to reverse biodiversity loss and stop dangerous climate change. It's all tied together.
No, thank you so much. And I feel like that's a really positive note to end on. So thank you very much for joining us, Ian.
My pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Born Free podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to our YouTube channel to watch the episodes, follow us on social media, or head to our website, bornfree.org.uk. My name's Sarah Locke, and our producer's Philip Fortuna. See you next time.